Now let us talk about French Louisiana. The picture of the man you see in the upper right-hand corner is none other than Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Sieur de Bienville. He is the youngest of the Lemoyne family, and he is the first official governor of Louisiana. And he and his older brother Pierre Lemoyne, known as Sieur de Iberville, were the two founders of the Louisiana colony after LaSalle. We'll see the early problems in the colony, and then the proprietary experiment, followed by the Natchitoches settlement, the Company of the West, the founding of New Orleans, the bubble bursts. Then we'll see the peculiar institution that is slavery in Louisiana, religion in the new colony, and art and culture in Louisiana. The European influence on Louisiana lasts to this very day in aspects of religion, culture, architecture, economics, politics, art and literature, and government. Louisiana stands very unique from the rest of the country. It's been the lasting charm of Louisiana, but it has also been to the everlasting detriment to the state at times. The man for whom Louisiana is named was King Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. Louis XIV was the man that made France into a world power, ruling from his great palace in Versailles. He then made France into a mercantile power. Those of you that are interested could watch the Netflix Versailles to see about how Louis came to power in his early days. Louis XIV was an absolute ruler, and that is, he believed that he had the mandate of God to rule France. And with this, he assembled a court of very able-bodied men and great advisors, the most important of which were his ministers of the Marine, Louis Xiv, Comte de Pontchartrain, who was the French minister of the Marine, and his son and successor, Jean-Frédéric Philippot, the Comte de Maurepas. That is, whom the two Great Lakes of Louisiana are named after, Lakes Pontchartrain and Maurepas. Sebastien de la Presse, the Marquis de Vauban, was a military engineer, great at the construction of fortresses. And so Louis XIV commissioned another expedition to the Mississippi in order to isolate the British on the Atlantic seaboard and blunt the Spanish advance coming up from Mexico and the old American Southwest. The choice for this expedition were 2 of 11 brothers born to a French-Canadian nobleman. Pierre Lemoyne, Sieur de Iberville, lived from 1661 to 1706. He was 37 years old at the time of the expedition. And his youngest brother, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Sieur de Bienville, who was only 19 at the time of the expedition. The expedition took place in 1698. They reached the sites of Mobile, Dauphin Island, and then Biloxi, which is now Ocean Springs, Mississippi. They were not going to do the same mistake as LaSalle. They were going to break off inland before the mouth of the river and then cross it. They reached the Mississippi on March the 9th, 1699, and since it was Mardi Gras Day, they named the spot Pont du Mardi Gras. They moved upriver toward Baton Rouge and then into the Point Coupee area on the west bank of the river, northwest of Baton Rouge, and they begin to establish good relations with the native tribes and then return to the Gulf Coast. Bienville especially seemed to have a very common touch with the native tribes, and they became his allies. The overall plan was to link Canada, French North America, all the way to the Gulf via the Mississippi Valley. They needed a permanent settlement to secure the mouth of the river. The problem is that the court at Versailles was very reluctant to grant the necessary materials and even the colonists. And so Iberville returned to France while Bienville stayed to scout out the land. When Bienville returned to the Mississippi River, he found a British ship. Through a great deal of bluffing and essentially lying, he convinced the British ship to turn around and go back out into the Gulf because he convinced them that a major French fleet was around the bend of the river, which it was not. This became known as the Tour d'Anglais, or English Turn. What are the problems in the colony? 1. The soil was not exactly good for what they had in mind, and there was very poor trade coming from Canada. It did not seem like the French Canadians were interested in trading down the river. Secondly, the colonists were soldiers and not farmers, and furthermore, they weren't very good soldiers at that. There were not enough women, and while in France, Iberville died. His replacement, the commissary commissioner, then quarrels with Bienville, and this becomes a standing trademark of French colonial Louisiana and Louisiana in general, quarreling over power and politics rather than getting things done. When Louis XIV died at the age of 77, France was practically bankrupt from numerous wars that Louis had been prosecuting all throughout his reign. At one point, he even tried to seize the Spanish throne in what was known as the War of the Spanish Succession. And Louisiana was a problem because it cost more to maintain than it produced, but it was like holding a tiger by the tail. You didn't want to let go of it, but holding on to it wasn't all that pleasant either. Several key points. Great deal of lack of attention made to the colony. The proprietors would be absentee, and the first colonists were unsuited to colonial life. They were taking people out of prisons, convicts, people that France didn't want to have around anymore, and sending them, and soldiers that couldn't hack it. And so anybody from Louisiana that says, we're blue bloods, we're among the first colonists, and they try to rub your nose in it, just remember to say, oh, you're the descendant of convicts or soldiers that couldn't hack it in the real army. And again, the petty quarrels and bickering deprived the colony of direction and leadership. Louis was very impressed by the British model of proprietary colonies, especially the Carolinas and Pennsylvania. And so the first proprietor was Antoine Crozat, the Marquis de Châtel. He was born a peasant and made himself into a millionaire. He then went to the king and was given a charter in 1712, but he became what was known as an absentee proprietor. He never visited his own colony. Instead, he sent Antoine de la Motte, Sieur de Cadillac, first official governor of Louisiana. Bienville was retained as military commandant. Now, Cadillac's initiatives was the creation of a superior council, a French governing body. He established a legal code called the Custom of Paris. He begins to establish trade between Louisiana and the Spanish as well as the English. He appoints Jean-Baptiste Duclos as commissary commissioner to develop cash crops, that is, indigo, tobacco, and corn. The problem is that Cadillac did not like Bienville, and Bienville had no use for Cadillac, and so they begin to bicker instead of getting work done. Cadillac then turned his attention to securing the borders of Louisiana, and so he sends Louis Xiv de Saint-Denis up the Red River toward the border with New Spain, and there he establishes Fort Saint-Jean-Baptiste in 1714, the oldest settlement in Louisiana. It later becomes known as the town of Natchitoches, and that's how it is pronounced. The map that you see here is showing the Red River in red and the blue dot indicating the location of Natchitoches, Louisiana. Eventually, Crozat gave up his charter in 1715, especially after the death of Louis XIV. When Louis XIV died, he had outlived his own son and his grandson, and so his great-grandson became King Louis XV at the age of 3. Because no person can rule when they are only 3 years old, a regent was appointed, his cousin, the Duke of Orleans, usually named Philippe, and in this case he was. The Duke of Orleans was actually a very good ruler of France, a great regent of France. The French colonial policy was reorganized under the Council of the Marine, And in 1717, the Duke gave control of Louisiana to a corporation named the Company of the West, run by a man named John Law, a gambler and speculator who came from Scotland. Law had helped organize the Bank of France, so he had some skins on the wall economically. Law sells stock in the company. He uses the assets to develop Louisiana under a subdivision of the Company of the West called the Company of the Indies. Now remember, when you sell stock, you have to wait for the stock to mature. Keep that in mind. Law, of course, has the same problems that Crozat has because he divides power in the colony and was an absentee proprietor himself. But he did commission Bienville to build a city to guard the mouth of the Mississippi River. And this is how New Orleans came to be. The city was established in 1718 to guard the bend in the river, which sat at the head of the Indian portage tracts that went from the river to the lake, most notably the St. John Ridge and the Esplanade Ridge and the Gentilly Ridge and the Metairie Ridge. The city was named in honor of the Duke of Orleans. The city was laid out and planned by Adrien de Pouget, who also built a levee that served as a wharf. Within 10 years, the city had 1,000 people living in it. Company policies is that it had a better administrative organization than Crozat had. They encouraged immigration from France, especially of women. You always have to have the right number of women in a colony, or the colony cannot be successful. They allowed the convicts to settle as well. They sponsored German Alsatian immigrants. Alsace-Lorraine is in the northeastern corner of France, which butts up against Germany. That region has changed hands between France and Germany on several occasions, and so the people there speak both French and German. And the interesting thing is that those with the French last names consider themselves ethnically German, and those with the German last names consider themselves ethnically French. And so you have people in this city such as the Leidenheimer family and the Binder family, who are Alsatians. Well, these German Alsatian immigrants settled the Gulf Coast and what is known as the German coast, upriver and on the west bank from New Orleans. They were led by Charles Frederick Dannenberg. More than 2,000 of them came. The French called them des Allemands, which means the Germans. In the upper left, you see the map of the city of New Orleans laid out by Pouget. And on the left, you see the German coast upriver from New Orleans. Here you see yet another map, and if you look to the left along the river, you see Les Allemands. They're called Stun, I believe. It's the German coast. The bubble bursts. The Mississippi bubble was this increase in stock sales that created a false sense of prosperity. These people were looking to strike it rich. Law had issued about 600,000 shares of stock and merged the Banque Générale with the Company of the Indies, and the French government begins to issue more and more paper money, creating more inflation. And when the paper money took a drop in value, shares in the company declined. Rumors then came about, and when rumors of financial insolvency came about, there was a run on the stocks before they matured. People were going in saying, give me what I can get now before I can lose my value of my stock. And this caused a major depression. The bubble bursts. Law is financially ruined by this. The company crashes. He had to flee France to avoid prosecution. France managed to retire the debt by raising taxes on the people. They bailed out the company on the backs of the middle classes in France and the lower classes as well. This leads to disharmony. This leads to frustration. This is one of the steps toward the French Revolution. And Louisiana, for its part, now comes back under the crown, where Bienville and Sieur de la Chaise share power. Bienville is then recalled in 1724, and Jacques Perrier becomes the governor of Louisiana. As I said, Bienville had had a strong relationship with the Indians. Perrier did not. He went against his word. The Natchez revolted. They attacked and killed numerous settlers. Eventually, the Natchez were defeated at great cost. The city of White Apple was taken. The Natchez were destroyed as a tribe. Morale was low until Bienville was returned. He sent the refugees from the war back to their homes. He then launched an expedition against the Chickasaw to recover some Natchez warriors and brought many Natchez down to live closer to the French settlements. In 1741, Bienville retired to go live in France, but he did not leave Louisiana until 1743. African slavery in North and South America grew in large part because Africans, unlike the native populations, had better resistance to European diseases and were less prone to escape. Slavery in Louisiana began under Crozat, who made his fortune in human chattel. That's how he became a millionaire. When Louisiana was established, in order to regulate the lives and the commerce in slaves, they established what was known as the Code Noir. This is called the Black Code, is the legal governing code standard concerning slavery in the French colonies. It had things like slaves must be baptized Catholic, slaves must wed each other in the Catholic Church, slaves could only be freed with government approval. And the Black Code did not apply just to slaves. It also applied to Jews and regulated their comings and goings and what they could do and could not do. The permanence of slavery made some despair and others rebellious, and rebellion was an overriding fear. This is what makes it the peculiar institution. Many enslaved others because they felt that they were too simple and that they were superior to African Americans, and yet African Americans were seen as enough of a danger to be able to organize slave rebellions. So the Code Noir contained a proviso limiting how many blacks that could congregate in public. Well, despite this, you have the formation of an Afro-Creole society, the growth of the voodoo religion, for instance, which came out of the West Indies and was in large part a means of resistance to white power, and very associated with Catholicism. You had the development of the Creole dialect, a strong emphasis on family, and slaves tended to bond because they came from the same general area in Africa. They didn't just come from every spot in Africa. Africa is a huge continent. It's the second largest in the world. They came from the region of Senegal, Gambia, and Angola, mostly along the west coast and the southwest coast of Africa. Religion in Louisiana under the French came from a variety of religious orders that settled, such as the Jesuits. The Capuchins, the Franciscans, were the first formal school for education in Louisiana. Literacy was not a particular concern in a colony that was trying to be an agricultural colony more than anything. The schools trained people in basic education. The Capuchins also invited, however, the Ursuline nuns to Louisiana in 1727. And the Ursulines established a convent, a school, a hospital, an orphanage, and a house to chaperone what were known as the casket girls, called the casket girls because they brought their belongings in small wooden cassettes, as they were called, which people called caskets. And these Ursuline nuns solidified the Catholic faith in the city. Who were the casket girls? They were young women that were brought to Louisiana to marry the settlers. And what about art and culture in Louisiana? Well, you had, even in the early days, Louisiana historians beginning to document the colony and publish manuscripts. Artisans and craftsmen flourished in New Orleans. People entertained themselves through a variety of activities that you see there before you: hunting, fishing, trapping, cards, gambling, dancing and drinking, women's activities. You had religious festivals like Mardi Gras and All Saints, and most importantly, you had the opera. You see there is the Bourbon Orleans Hotel, now a 4 Points, I believe, by Sheraton, but at one time, it was the French Opera House of New Orleans. And pretty soon, in the next lesson, I'll be showing you the Spanish Opera House of New Orleans.